dinner in half a minute? How about a last-minute dinner party for 300 people? What about an omelet? Voila! The Omelet Show. Today on The French Chef.
The French Chef is made possible by a grant from the Polaroid Corporation.
Welcome to The French Chef. I'm Julia Child. Here is the standard classic omelet. It's flat and it's French and it's very lovely and tender and soft, and it's just really like just lightly coagulated eggs with a little cloak around holding them together. It's actually the perfect kind of an omelet, and it's perfect as a quick meal, and it makes a lovely little lunch with a green salad. And we're going to do all kinds of omelets, plain omelets, cheese omelets, omelette aux champignons, and so forth, and we're even going to have a dining room party with omelets. All you need to make an omelet is a hot fire, and you need a bowl, and you need some butter, and some salt and pepper, and some eggs. Then you have to have the right kind of an omelet pan, because, as you saw how that omelet was made, you have to manipulate the pan to get the eggs moving around so that they will form the omelet. And this is called an omelet pan, but it's not the kind of an omelet that we're going to use. This is made for the souffle or puffy omelet, so that's not it. Now, there is a omelet pan which we call the status pan, which costs a great deal of money and is of very highly polished aluminum, and it's about 3/8 inch thick. And there is also the plain old no-stick pan, and it's the no-stick pan that I think is very good to use, and they're not very expensive, and it works out absolutely perfectly. What you want in a pan is a handle so that you can grab the pan by its handle, and you want sides that should be about 2 inches high. And that other pan, I don't think the sides are quite high enough. And the great thing about when you're doing the flat French omelet is what makes the perfect omelet. Well, it's how fast you do it. An omelet takes 20 seconds to do is all. And if it takes longer, if you have more eggs, it takes longer to cook. And so more eggs makes a rather leathery omelet. And the best and the tenderest one is made out of 2 to 3 eggs. And you want a pan. This pan is about 7 to 7.5 inches bottom diameter. And that's just about the right size for the 2 to 3 egg omelet. Now I have there my 2 eggs. And then we just have a bit of salt and pepper. Just a big pinch of salt and then some freshly ground pepper. And that's your omelet base. And then beat it up. I'm using chopsticks. You can use a whisk. And if you like, you can beat in a little tiny bit of water. I'll put it in about a teaspoon of water there. And this is going to be omelet for one person. 2 to 3 eggs. And then if you'd rather use a whip, you could do that. But when you beat up the eggs, you beat them up just enough to blend the whites and the yolks. You don't really beat them. So there's your omelet mixture ready. And now you have your pan over high heat, and then you want a good tablespoon of butter. And then you tilt the pan and let the butter go all the way around the edges and the bottom. And then the pan has to be very hot. You put this over highest heat. And then, just before the butter begins to brown, in go the eggs. And you should hear them sizzle as they hit the pan, and then you wait for a moment. Then you grab the pan and just begin swirling it flat around the heat, and then gradually jerking it towards you. There's your omelet, turning over on itself, forming itself in the bottom of the pan. And then it's done. And you have to flip it over, and you flip it over by turning the pan upside down on the plate. I'm going to do that again, because sometimes that seems to be difficult. There's your omelet in the bottom of the pan. You can see you want to be able to turn it over, because that's not the good side. So you turn your pan around, and there is your hand with the thumb on top, so you can grab it and turn the pan over. You have a hot plate here, and then lip of pan just off center. Over she goes. And then if it hasn't formed up quite properly, take 2 forks and just push it together. That didn't form well. This is having been twice unmolded. It's overcooked itself a little bit. So then you can put a little butter on the top to make it shiny, and then to dress it up a little bit, just a little bit of parsley. And there you are, and that's all there is to it. And I'm going to cut that open again so you can see how it looks.
Thank you, Julia. Okay. Other egg dishes. Yikes. Other egg dishes are let's start with diluted. So I mentioned custards and creams a few moments ago, but let's reiterate what those are. Now our egg gel is going to be much more diffuse, mixed with other ingredients, especially cream and milk. Usually cooked in an oven with a water bath to the best effect with a water bath. And again, that water bath helps you control the temperature inside your oven so that you're not cooking too hot, but the oven gives you that consistency of temperature. Some examples: creme brulee. Some of you are probably familiar with creme brulee. Here, where we have our custard overlaid over a sugar mixture, and cooked, but then browned with flame. And that browning again. Oh, here I even give you where to look for Maillard reactions. We're going to cover these in detail later, but the browning enhances that flavor. I'm mentioning ice cream here because I love to mention ice cream. Some styles of ice cream include significant quantities of egg yolk custard, especially the French style. Those will add texture and improve consistency, especially in ice creams that are low in fat, if you're using low-fat milk, for example. Although why you'd replace milk fat with egg yolk fat, I'm not sure. Cheesecake is another example. This is a kind of a custard. And although it's so dilute with other ingredients, we stabilize that with starch, and we'll talk about using starch to stabilize our gel matrices in later lectures. Creams are also similar to custards and also cooked, but they maintain a very malleable texture, and some of them are even pourable, as we'll see. But then they'll also use primarily yolks in many cases as the coagulant. You're familiar with vanilla pudding, cream pies. Those are cream egg dishes. And then we can have a different set of consistencies. For example, if we're familiar with the eclair French pastry, that's pastry cream again, a thick consistency maintained with the addition of a stabilizer such as starch or sugar. Finally, back to foams. I'll mention meringues. The nice thing about meringues is that we can see that the foams, while we talked about optimizing our foams, egg foams can offer a variety of different textures, from very soft and wet to very firm and dry. And we'll even see many meringues cooked, and so they can even have a brownish, almost quite solid texture. Again, we can use confectioner's sugar to add viscosity and stabilize that foam if we like. What you'll find is that confectioner's sugar dissolves much more readily than granular table sugar, and that again can affect the consistency of your experience or your and the texture of your foam. Soufflés are different from meringues in that there are other ingredients there as well, frequently diluted with creams to a certain extent, but baked. And the key with soufflés is that different components, both air that's whipped into the mixture and then water that vaporizes as the soufflé is cooked, expand on heating, and they expand a lot, and that leads to the rising of that souffle. Now, souffles are very delicate, as you may know, and the trick there is to couple that expansion that's dependent on the heat in the oven with the coagulation or the aggregation of the protein around those expanding air bubbles. And the protein are what's going to give you some solidity. And if you're not successful, then your souffle will collapse when it cools. But if you're successful, you will have stabilized those expanding air bubbles or gas bubbles with coagulated protein. Those are a variety of egg dishes that we can consider. But what about eggs as ingredients themselves? So we're going to encounter eggs again and again throughout the semester. So let's think about where. In breads, especially quick breads, you'll find that you can include eggs to alter the consistency. The idea here is that when you're using flour in which there is little gluten structure developed, and we'll skip ahead just a hair now to say that glutens are proteins that give rise to the spongy, chewy, toothy structure of bread, and the quantity of gluten depends on the kind of flour that you're using. Anywhere from cake flour with very little gluten to bread flour with very high gluten content. So when you're cooking cakes or quick breads, you're going to find yourself using a lot more egg, especially the egg white, to thicken that texture, give you more of a toothy texture. Also, when you're cooking whole wheat breads, there again you're going to see low gluten content, and it'll behoove you to include egg there as an ingredient to stabilize that long-range protein aggregate structure. In batters, so anything from cookie batters, waffle batters, especially to coatings for your deep fried fish or chili rellenos, for example, you're going to make a batter with a nice light airy egg foam that's folded in. Folding in gently so that you don't disrupt the foam structure, but you incorporate that foamy airiness into the batter structure itself. And when you cook it, again, you retain that foamy structure and result in a very light pastry sort of exterior. Ice cream. I mentioned again where we'll use especially egg yolk custards to improve the consistency. As well, the emulsifiers that I've mentioned before, those amphipathic molecules, those phospholipids that have polar head groups and nonpolar tail groups, can help keep ice crystals small, and we'll talk a lot about ice cream next week, and improve the texture of your ice cream. We'll also see egg yolks used as emulsifiers in sauces, and we can thicken water-based sauces by adding egg yolk, and that stabilizes a suspension of oil drops in water that increases the apparent viscosity or the apparent texture or thickness of that sauce. There are a variety of other ways to thicken sauces, but we can use egg yolk as well. Again, I mentioned the fact that these emulsifiers present in eggs can be found in other ingredients, and especially in ice cream, you'll see lecithin from other vegetable sources, not from egg yolk, used as emulsifiers. Finally, pasta. There are lots of pastas that do not involve use of eggs, and we'll talk a lot about those. But for egg pastas, the yolk improves the flavor, but the egg white albumins again add structure to low gluten flours. So when you're making your noodles with a flour with low gluten content, you have to add something to give it some structure and some toothiness, and that something is egg white albumin. I'm going to wrap up this lecture just with a little stroll through some interesting egg compositions. Eggnog, something that's only recently left my refrigerator after the holidays. Again, very dilute proteins network and not concentrated enough protein to form a dense gel. So we really are only adding texture to our liquor here, which is what eggnog is all about. In the raw, here is just a snapshot of some sushi that includes raw quail eggs perched on top. This is kind of a 2-for-1 because in addition, we're looking at salmon roe, which is a salmon egg. We've only talked really about chicken eggs in this lecture. We might come back and talk more about other eggs in other cases. Anyway, raw eggs here, and in particular the raw yolk, giving us a great flavor to our sushi. Oh yes. So here's another interesting example that allows us to talk briefly about egg preservation. This is a pidan, also known as a 1,000-year-old egg. This is a Chinese tradition. It is not 1,000 years old. It's probably only weeks to months old. We'll come to that at the end. But note here that the egg white is solidified, but as a clear gel. And we'll encounter lots of clear gels later when we talk about meat. So whatever we've done to those egg proteins in the pidan, we haven't caused them to form this opaque network. Okay, acid can be used to preserve eggs. So first we'll boil an egg, but then we'll store it under vinegar, and this inhibits the growth of bacteria. Fermentation will also, so the storing under vinegar means low pH, and low pH can be accomplished in a number of ways. One of those ways is by fermentation. So in some cultures you'll actually boil your eggs, but then or have them raw and then store them under a fermenting mass of rice, for example, or some other starchy vegetable, and that fermentation results in a low pH that again doesn't cook the eggs necessarily, but preserves them against invasion from microbes. We can also use salt to preserve eggs, 35% weight to volume, salt to water. Again, limitation of bacterial growth. Not necessarily cooking, so you can preserve an egg in a raw state for quite a while, although the salt itself can induce some unfolding of proteins. Okay, finally back to the pidan. So in this case, they're using ash from different sources and other ingredients as well to not lower the pH, but to raise the pH. And this causes proteins to denature and form a very diffuse, and in this case transparent network. So a nice solid gel. Now also the yolk begins to precipitate, but you can see in this top picture that the yolk is actually fairly liquid still. You might find that appetizing, you might not. But what's really interesting to me is this nice clear yolk, and the discoloration comes from other additives that are included in the recipe, such as tea leaves and other plant material, etc. Here at the bottom we have another interesting egg, another pidan. This is called a pear blossom egg, and as the proteins are denatured, they're also degraded. And what we see happening in this is the crystallization of some degraded protein components. Some amino acids actually are cleaved off of, their side chains are cleaved off, and they form these crystalline networks that are very, very beautiful. I will admit that I've never eaten a pidan, but I'm dying to, so extra credit to the student that brings me some 1,000-year-old eggs to my office. Also here again is this, there are lots of ways of accelerating this process so that you can accomplish the preservation in a matter of days instead of weeks. And so if anybody's interested in taking on pidan as one of their projects, I'd say start now. Oh yeah, last but not least, balut. So this is a Asian delicacy. Balut is a Philippine word with an unclear etymology. Could mean a few different things. In this case, the egg is allowed to develop for maybe 9 or 10 days before being cooked and eaten in the whole. And so here you see the yolk, by no means completely consumed by the growing fetus, by the growing embryo, and then here we see the growing animal itself. Okay, so leaving you now with Okay.